This is not a rumor. This is not speculation. And I am absolutely not exaggerating when I tell you that what just exploded between General Motors and the Canadian government is one of the most seismic corporate political showdowns we have seen on this continent in decades. Surprised. And if you are an American worker, an American investor, or just somebody who cares about where this economy is actually heading, you need to stop whatever you are doing right now. Sit down and hear every single word of what I'm about to tell you. Because this story is not just about Canada. It is not just about cars. It is about your job, your wallet, your retirement account, and the future of North American manufacturing as we know it. Rushed, and it is moving at warp speed. Here is what happened. General Motors Canada pressed ahead with plans to eliminate the midnight shift at its Oshawa Assembly Plant, a move that ended round-the-clock production of Chevrolet Silverado pickups in Oshawa starting January 30th, 2026. Now you might be thinking, okay, one shift, one plant. How bad can it be? Let me give you the real numbers. GM eliminated the third shift at its assembly plant in Oshawa, cutting about 700 jobs inside the plant, plus another 300 to 500 workers at parts companies that supply the facility, according to Unifor. And when you factor in every ripple across the supply chain, the ensuing layoffs affect up to 1,200 workers throughout the auto supply chain in the industrial belt just east of Toronto. Now here is what makes this gut punch even worse. This was not the first time GM did this in Canada, not even close. The company ended production of its battery electric delivery van, the BrightDrop, citing poor demand, resulting in 1,200 workers at its Cami assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario, losing their jobs. So, in under 6 months, GM wiped out well over 2,000 Canadian manufacturing jobs across 2 separate communities, 2 separate plants, 2 separate sets of families. It was the second major workforce reduction by the company in Canada in less than 6 months. And the official reason GM gave: the cut comes less than a year after the company first warned it would scale back truck production in Oshawa, citing U.S. tariffs and an evolving trade environment as factors in its shift planning and export strategy. Evolving trade environment. That is corporate language. That is a euphemism. What it actually means is 25% tariffs on Canadian-built vehicles crossing into the United States, and a company making a cold calculation about where it can produce the same truck for less money. And here is the number that should make your blood boil. Earlier this week, GM said it earned $2.7 billion in 2025, and it is now projecting $10.3 billion to use $11.7 billion in net income in 2026.2 billions in profit, billions more projected. And 500 workers in Oshawa walked out the door anyway. Now let me give you the move GM made at the same exact time, because this is the part that exposes exactly what is going on. While GM cuts a shift in Oshawa, the company is adding 250 temporary workers to its plant in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Both the Oshawa and Fort Wayne plants build the Chevrolet Silverado. Same truck, same model, different country, lower cost temporary labor. They did not eliminate production. They relocated it. And the workers left behind in Oshawa? One GM worker said it is gut-wrenching to think about moving away from Oshawa, where he was born and raised, and where his 4 children and 7 grandchildren live, because he does not think he will be able to find a job there after the layoff. That is not a statistic. That is a human being. That is a family. And there are more than 1,000 of those stories in Oshawa alone. Before I go any further, if this is giving you clarity that you are not getting anywhere else, hit subscribe right now. Tap that bell, because this story keeps developing. More decisions are coming. More plants are at risk, and you do not want to be the last one to know. Now here is where this story goes from dramatic to explosive, because the Canadian government did not sit there and quietly absorb the pain. They did not issue a polite statement and move on. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly stated unequivocally that Ottawa will claw back incentive money after GM confirmed the layoff of approximately 500 workers at the Ontario truck plant. She was not bluffing. She meant every word. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly said Ottawa would act to reclaim funding tied to both the Oshawa facility and GM's Ingersoll plant, where production of BrightDrop electric vans was halted in October. And she was crystal clear about the stakes involved. Joly said, "We want justice for Canadian taxpayers who have no time for those who don't believe in us." Now, let me tell you exactly what taxpayer money we are talking about. The federal and Ontario governments agreed in 2022 to contribute up to $259 million each to upgrade the Oshawa and Ingersoll sites, a package officials said would safeguard 2,600 jobs. $259 million per government, $500 million in Canadian public money, total, invested to protect Canadian jobs. And GM took the money, cut the jobs, and now Ottawa is coming to take it back. The clawback would amount to millions, and Ottawa said it would work to secure new employment for affected workers. But Joly did not stop there. She also cut GM where it hurts most, at the border. In response to GM's decision to scale back its manufacturing footprint in Canada, the federal government reduced the number of U.S.-assembled vehicles that GM can export to Canada on a duty-free basis. And she made the future crystal clear. She warned that if the company did not continue investing in Canada, public funds would be redirected to competitors willing to expand. And Stellantis already learned this lesson the hard way. Joly's ministry recently served Stellantis with a default notice related to its idled Brampton plant, illustrating a pattern of holding manufacturers accountable. Ottawa is not issuing warnings anymore. They are issuing legal notices. This confrontation signals a harder line from Ottawa, treating public auto subsidies as performance-based contracts. That is a seismic shift in how democratic governments deal with multinational corporations. You want our taxpayer money? Fine. But if you take it and walk away from the workers we paid you to protect, we are coming for every single dollar. And we are bringing lawyers. Now let me show you the engine driving all of this, because nothing here happened in a vacuum. General Motors revised its 2025 earnings guidance, projecting adjusted earnings before interest and taxes between $10 billion and $12.5 billion, down from its earlier estimate of $13.7 billion to $15.7 billion. This adjustment reflects an anticipated $4 billion to $5 billion impact from newly imposed tariffs on imported automobiles and parts. $4 to $5 billion in a single year. That is the direct cost of the 25% tariffs slapped on Canadian-built vehicles entering the United States. And that is just GM. The cumulative tariff impact on major automakers, including Toyota, Volkswagen, GM, and Ford, has already reached $11.7 billion as of mid-2025, highlighting the ongoing challenges posed by the trade policies. And what does a trillion-dollar corporation do when it is hit with a bill that size? It passes the cost to someone else. There is no way for $10 billion to be absorbed by the automakers and suppliers alone. Consumers and workers are going to bear some of these costs, said one industry analyst. Now, here is the piece of this story that nobody is saying loudly enough. The part about what Canada actually offered GM to keep those workers employed. On April 15, 2025, the Government of Canada implemented an auto-remission framework allowing Canada's automakers to import a set quantity of vehicles from the U.S. counter-tariff-free, provided that specified production levels are maintained and companies follow through on their planned investments in Canada. Ottawa literally handed GM a lifeline, a way to avoid retaliatory tariffs, for free, as long as they kept Canadian workers on the floor. GM took the lifeline and then cut the workers anyway. So Ottawa responded. Ottawa's move to limit tariff-free imports for GM and Stellantis means they will no longer be eligible for that exemption. You broke the deal. Now you lose the benefit. That is the new reality. And Trump has said his tariffs are intended to drive auto manufacturing back to the United States. And his administration wants future North American supply chains to prioritize American production. That is the stated goal. But the actual outcome on the ground is more complicated than that. And it matters to every American watching this right now. Let me bring this off the financial charts and into the real world for a minute, because behind every one of these numbers is a family, a community, a city that built its entire identity around making things. One GM worker told CBC Radio he has been at the plant his whole life. "I'm third-generation GM," he said. "Maybe my kids would like to work here someday, but with the tariffs, that might not be possible." 3 generations, one family, one plant. And now it is crumbling under the weight of a trade war that the people on that assembly line had absolutely no say in. The Oshawa plant makes the Chevrolet Silverado, and its parts cross the border between 6 and 8 times before completion. "We're probably facing the biggest industrial crisis we've ever faced," Unifor Local 222 President Jeff Gray said. Parts crossing the border 6 to 8 times before a single truck is finished. That is how deeply integrated this supply chain was. That is how much value was created on both sides of that border. And now that integration is being ripped apart, stitch by stitch. Oshawa's unemployment rate has climbed to 9%, the second highest in the country. The only city with a higher unemployment rate is Windsor, which has also been stung by the auto tariffs. 2 auto cities, both economically devastated, both sitting right next to the American border. And the parallel to Flint, Michigan, is impossible to ignore. GM was born in Flint. It was the soul of that city. And then, over decades, plant by plant, job by job, GM pulled out. The poverty, the disinvestment, the eventual collapse of infrastructure, all of it traces back to the hollowing out of that industrial community. The people of Oshawa and Ingersoll are watching that history, and they are terrified they are watching their own future. There are auto sector layoffs elsewhere, including in Brampton, Ontario, where Stellantis last year indefinitely paused a renovation of an assembly plant, leaving 3,000 workers inside the plant uncertain about their future. And in October, Stellantis scrapped plans to build the Jeep Compass at its Brampton plant, instead building it at an idled facility in Belvidere, Illinois, a decision widely derided in Canada as a move to appease Trump. Oshawa, Ingersoll, Brampton, Windsor, Oakville, Ontario's entire auto belt is bleeding. This is not one event. This is a systematic dismantling. Now let me tell you about the people who are not going quietly, because Canada's biggest private sector union is absolutely furious. And they are not just issuing strongly worded press releases. After the U.S. imposed an unjust 25% tariff on Canadian-built vehicles, GM publicly ramped up Silverado production in Fort Wayne, Indiana, before announcing the elimination of the third shift in Oshawa. Unifor presented GM with a viable plan to retain the third shift until the union and company enter contract negotiations in the fall of 2026, which the company chose to reject. They offered GM a way out, a path that would have preserved those jobs until a proper negotiation could take place. GM looked at that plan and said, "No, we're upset. The members are upset. The union is upset," said Jeff Gray, president of Unifor Local 222. "We feel it was a reckless decision from General Motors." Unifor's national president, Lana Payne, went further, much further. She accused GM of caving directly to Washington. She said GM is making Oshawa workers pay for that appeasement with their jobs. And even in a brutal trade war, auto companies can make different decisions, Payne said. Decisions that respect the contributions and skilled work of Canadian auto workers. Decisions that show Canadian consumers that these automakers actually care about the market they sell into. Stunning. And they are backing those words with action. Plans are underway to create programming that retrains auto workers who have been laid off, including sessions on resume writing and basic computer skills. "We will do everything in our power to make sure that is up and running as fast as possible and help members through the transition," Gray said. And at the same time, the anger toward GM over the CAMI plant in Ingersoll is even rawer. GM's CAMI plant in Ingersoll is a mess. A $1 billion retooling in 2022, idled by 2025, fewer than 2,000 BrightDrop vans sold against a 50,000 production capacity. Now, 200 Unifor workers face layoffs, and Trump's 25% tariffs shut the border. The plant was built to produce 50,000 vans a year. They sold fewer than 2,000, and every one of the workers who retrained, who showed up, who believed in that investment, they are the ones holding the bag. Now let me bring in the one voice that the entire financial world stops to listen to. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, The man who has been right about markets and economies for over 6 decades. And what he has been saying about this exact situation should stop you cold. In an interview with CBS that aired on Sunday, Buffett said, "Tariffs are actually, we've had a lot of experience with them. They're an act of war, to some degree." An act of war. Those are not the words of a man who thinks this is going to work out fine. Buffett said tariffs over time serve as a tax on goods and could raise prices for consumers. "The tooth fairy doesn't pay 'em," Buffett said with a laugh. Tariffs disrupt trade between countries by raising taxes on imported goods, and those new costs are often passed on to consumers through higher prices. And at the Berkshire annual meeting in May 2025, he went even further. "Trade should not be a weapon," Buffett said at Berkshire Hathaway's shareholder meeting in front of thousands in Omaha. And then this. "It's a big mistake, in my view, when you have 7.5 billion people that don't like you very well, and you got 300 million that are crowing in some way about how well they've done. I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's wise," Buffett said. 7.5 billion people, 300 million Americans, and a trade policy that is making enemies of the closest allies we have. That is what Buffett sees, and his actions match his words. Buffett has been in defensive mode, selling stocks for 10 straight quarters. Berkshire dumped more than $134 billion worth of stock in 2024, mainly due to reductions in Berkshire's 2 largest equity holdings, Apple and Bank of America. And the cash pile he has been building? Buffett's legendary cash hoard hit a record $347.7 billion at the 2025 Berkshire annual meeting, while his warnings about trade wars and market volatility underscored a world of economic uncertainty. $347.7 billion in cash, sitting on the sidelines, not being put to work. And one shareholder at that annual meeting captured the sentiment of every investor in the room. Warren Buffett has steered away from discussing tariffs, and people are clamoring to hear what he thinks. He obviously knows something we don't because he's stockpiling cash. When the greatest living investor is sitting on a record pile of cash and calling tariffs an act of war, you better believe he sees something the rest of us are just beginning to understand. And here is something else Buffett said. Something that I think is one of the most important statements about trade that any public figure has made in years. "I do think that the more prosperous the rest of the world becomes, it won't be at our expense. The more prosperous we'll become, and the safer we'll feel, and your children will feel someday." And that is not ideology. That is not partisan. That is 60 years of watching economies rise and fall, distilled into one sentence. And right now, we are doing the opposite. We are impoverishing our neighbors and calling it victory. Now, let me bring this directly home, because some of you watching this right now are thinking, okay, this is a Canada story, this is a union story, this does not affect me, and you are dead wrong. Tariffs have hit major automakers across the board. American ones such as Ford and General Motors paid out billions in 2025 and have said they expect to again this year. And corporations do not absorb billions in losses indefinitely. They pass them to you. Major automakers, including General Motors and Toyota, absorbed billions of dollars in tariff-related expenses throughout 2025. Similar costs are expected to continue into 2026. T6 Toyota, the world's largest automaker, has already been crushed. Toyota saw net income fall 25% in the first 9 months of its fiscal year 2026. Tariffs were a major driver, costing the company about 1.2 trillion yen, or roughly $8 billion. Toyota told CNBC that the tariffs are highly disruptive and cannot be sustained. Cannot be sustained. Those are the words of the most efficient automaker on the planet. And if Toyota says it cannot sustain this, what does that tell you about what is coming? One industry expert expects the affordability impact to become clearer by late spring and summer as manufacturers confront mounting cost burdens. He said manufacturers cannot continue absorbing billions of dollars in tariff expenses without eventually passing some of those costs to consumers. Automakers may introduce higher MSRPs, reduce incentives, or remove certain features to stabilize margins. Combined with already elevated transaction prices, Even modest increases could further push buyers toward entry-level models or out of the new car market entirely. If tariff conditions remain unchanged through 2026, consumers may soon begin feeling costs that automakers have so far absorbed internally. And according to Moody's, U.S. tariffs are expected to reduce global automakers' operating profits by over $30 billion in 2025, equivalent to more than 20% of their 2024 earnings. 20% gone. And the math is simple. You cannot remove 20% of an industry's profits without someone paying for it. And that someone is the person walking into a dealership, signing a financing agreement, and driving home. Now, here is the part of this story with the most dangerous long-term implications, the part that almost nobody is connecting out loud. While American automakers are retreating from Canada, the vacuum they are leaving behind is not going to stay empty for long. Joly contrasted GM's pullback with Toyota's launch of new RAV4 production in Ontario, highlighting where future government partnership may flow. And it is not just Toyota. Canada has been aggressively courting new automotive investment from Hyundai, Volkswagen, and Chinese manufacturers as U.S. tariffs disrupt the integrated North American supply chain. Chinese manufacturers in Canada, on the northern border of the United States, building cars for the North American market. Such a site, referring specifically to the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, could be attractive to a company looking to enter North America. China is looking at Canada, said one industry analyst, adding about CAMI, it is a relatively modern plant. Let that land for a moment. The plant that GM just abandoned, the one that taxpayers spent hundreds of millions to retool, is now being described as an attractive entry point for Chinese automakers into the North American market. And Canada, pushed to the wall by American tariffs, is actively open to that conversation. It is unlikely automakers will announce any big investments in Canada before a new trade agreement with the United States is negotiated, since Canada's domestic market is too small by itself. So here is where this ends up. If no new trade deal gets done, if the tariffs stay in place, if GM keeps retreating, Canada fills that void with someone else, and that someone might be flying a Chinese flag. The geopolitical consequences of that scenario extend far beyond cars, far beyond trade. This becomes a national security story, and it was created entirely by the choice to weaponize trade against the closest ally America has. Let me zoom all the way out now, because the GM Canada story is not just a moment. It is a marker. It is the signal that something much larger has shifted. For decades, Canada's auto sector has been creating good, middle-class jobs and driving economic growth. Canada's auto industry supports approximately 125,000 direct jobs, 80% of which are located in Ontario and comprises approximately 8% of the manufacturing GDP. 12. 125,000 direct jobs, 8% of manufacturing GDP. That is not a side industry. That is a cornerstone. And it is being hollowed out plant by plant, shift by shift. Automakers have reported billions in tariff hits. Steep aluminum and steel levies have also played a role. There is no immediate end in sight, but with CUSMA up for review in 2026, there could be movement on a new trade framework by mid-year. The CUSMA review, that is the renegotiation of the North American Trade Agreement, is the single most important economic event on the continent in 2026. Whatever comes out of it is going to determine the fate of millions of jobs, hundreds of communities, decades of investment. The U.S. economy already shrank for the first time in 3 years, with businesses rushing to avoid new tariffs. This has created uncertainty and disruption across supply chains. Uncertainty is the enemy of investment. It is the enemy of job creation. It is the enemy of growth. And right now, uncertainty is the only thing being manufactured at full capacity. The auto industry was built on a foundation of stability, of 30-year planning horizons, of cross-border partnerships forged over generations. And right now, that foundation has a crack running through it that grows wider every day these tariffs remain in place. GM is set to eliminate a third shift of workers at its Silverado truck plant in Oshawa as it boosts production in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and retools a plant in Orion, Michigan, to make more pickups by 2027. 29. So here is what GM is building. Production in the United States, sourced from lower-cost labor, assembled without the Canadian supply chain that took 30 years to develop. And yes, those are American jobs, but they are temporary jobs. Contingent jobs, jobs that exist only as long as the political winds stay in GM's favor. The people of Oshawa know this. The workers at Cami and Ingersoll know this. And somewhere in a boardroom in Detroit, the executives know this too. They are not building a sustainable future. They are reacting to a policy environment that could reverse overnight. And in the meantime, the communities they are leaving behind are paying the full price. So here is where I leave you. And I want to hear from you directly. Do you think what GM did was the right business decision? Do you think Ottawa was right to demand its money back? Do you think these tariffs are actually protecting American workers? Or are they just reshuffling pain from one group to another while corporations bank the difference? Drop your answer in the comments right now, because this is not a financial debate. This is a conversation about the kind of economy we want to live in. About whether we still believe that trade between close allies creates prosperity on both sides, or whether we have decided that economic nationalism, where everyone builds walls and everyone ends up poorer, is the road we want to walk down. Buffett put it simply, I do think that the more prosperous the rest of the world becomes, it won't be at our expense. The more prosperous we'll become, and the safer we'll feel, and your children will feel someday. That is not weakness. That is not globalist ideology. That is 60 years of watching economies work. And right now, we are ignoring that lesson at enormous cost. The CUSMA trade agreement is up for review. More plant decisions are coming. More communities are hanging in the balance. And I will be right here breaking every one of those developments down for you in plain English with real numbers and no spin. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you in the next one.